The evening sky had turned a deep purple as winter clouds rolled in over the city of Chicago. Streetlights flickered to life one by one, casting long shadows across the busy streets. A black Honda Civic merged smoothly into the flow of rush-hour traffic, its driver lost in thought about the mountain of paperwork waiting on her desk tomorrow morning. Behind the wheel sat Captain Anderson, a highly respected officer with the Chicago Police Department. At 38, she had earned her position through 15 years of dedicated service, becoming one of the youngest captains in the department's history. Her chocolate brown eyes scanned the road ahead as she mentally rehearsed tomorrow's departmental meeting points. The day had been particularly challenging. She'd spent hours reviewing civilian complaints, updating protocol manuals, and mediating a dispute between two senior officers. Now, all she wanted was to get home, kick off her shoes, and maybe catch up on that new crime drama everyone at work couldn't stop talking about. Light snowflakes began dancing in her headlights as she turned onto Lakeshore Drive. The weather forecast had predicted a light dusting, nothing unusual for a February evening in Chicago. She adjusted the heater, letting warm air chase away the lingering chill. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mom, probably checking if she was still coming over for Sunday dinner this weekend. The familiar route home allowed her mind to wander to happier thoughts. Her nephew's basketball game was coming up next week. He'd been begging her to attend for days, proud to show his aunt how he'd mastered his three-point shot. A small smile played across her lips as she remembered his excited voice on the phone. "Auntie, you have to come. I'm gonna be the star player." Traffic thinned out as she left the main thoroughfare, heading into a quieter residential area. The streets here were well maintained, lined with mature trees and modest single-family homes. She'd driven this route hundreds of times, knowing every stop sign and speed bump by heart. Her own house was just 10 minutes away, a cozy two-bedroom bungalow she'd bought 5 years ago. Captain Anderson checked her speedometer, exactly at the limit as always. Years of enforcing traffic laws had made careful driving second nature. She'd spent her early years as a patrol officer on these very streets, learning every corner of her beat, getting to know the shop owners, the school crossing guards, the elderly couples who would wave as she drove past. The playlist streaming through her car speakers switched to one of her favorite songs, and she hummed along softly. It had been her father's favorite too. He'd been so proud when she graduated from the police academy, though he never lived to see her make captain. "Always serve with honor," he told her at graduation. Those words had guided her entire career. Her dashboard clock read 7:45 p.m. If traffic stayed light, she'd be home in time to review some case files before bed. Being a captain meant the work never really stopped, but she wouldn't have it any other way. She loved her job, loved making a difference in her community, loved mentoring younger officers and showing them what good policing looked like. The falling snow was getting heavier now, creating a peaceful scene as it settled on parked cars and front lawns. Captain Anderson flicked on her wipers, keeping a careful eye on the increasingly slick road. Her thoughts drifted to the upcoming community outreach program she was planning, a series of workshops connecting local teenagers with police officers, building bridges of understanding and trust. Movement in her rearview mirror caught her attention. A patrol car had turned onto the street behind her, its headlights cutting through the gentle snowfall. She didn't recognize the vehicle number, must be from another precinct. The sight brought back memories of her own patrol days, the excitement and responsibility of being out on the streets, serving and protecting. Little did she know, this routine drive home was about to become anything but ordinary. As she continued down the quiet street, the patrol car's lights suddenly flashed to life, painting the snowy scene in alternating red and blue. Captain Anderson felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, one that had nothing to do with her rank and everything to do with experiences she'd hoped were behind her. And that's when everything changed. Captain Anderson's heart sank as the patrol car's lights flashed behind her. Years of experience told her to stay calm, but she couldn't shake the familiar feeling of dread washing over her. She'd been here before, too many times to count. With practiced precision, she signaled and pulled into a well-lit parking lot of a corner grocery store, positioning her car where the store's security cameras could capture the interaction. Through her rearview mirror, she watched the patrol car pull up behind her, its lights still flashing, painting the falling snow in alternating colors. Her training kicked in automatically. hands on the steering wheel, interior light on, engine off. She drew a deep breath, reminding herself that she'd done nothing wrong. The speedometer had shown she was right at the limit, her tags were current, and all her lights were working. She checked them just yesterday. Out of habit born from years on the force, she reached over and pressed the button on her dashboard camera. The small red light blinked to life, a quiet witness to whatever was about to unfold. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, "Always keep your cool, baby, no matter what." It was advice that had served her well throughout her career, especially in moments like this. The officer took his time approaching her vehicle, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. Through her side mirror, she could see him, Officer Thompson, according to his nameplate, walking with the kind of exaggerated swagger that made her internally cringe. In her years of training junior officers, she'd always emphasized the importance of approaching traffic stops with professional courtesy, not intimidation. The flashlight beam swept through her car, lingering longer than necessary. Captain Anderson kept her eyes forward, maintaining her professional composure despite the knot tightening in her stomach. She could hear Thompson speaking into his radio, running her plates. Any moment now, the system would show her vehicle was registered to a police captain, but experience told her that might not make a difference. "License and registration," Thompson barked, his flashlight beam deliberately angled to shine in her eyes. His tone was sharp, unnecessarily aggressive, exactly the kind of approach she'd worked so hard to eliminate in her precinct. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Good evening, officer," she responded calmly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. "I'm going to reach for my documentation now." She spoke clearly, making sure her movements were slow and deliberate. The weight of her captain's badge sat heavy in her jacket pocket, but she decided to wait before revealing it. Thompson's response was immediate and hostile. "I didn't ask for conversation. I said license and registration." His free hand rested on his holster, an unnecessary gesture that spoke volumes about his assumptions. Captain Anderson felt her jaw tighten, but her voice remained steady. "I understand, officer. I'm reaching for my purse now." She narrated her movements, just as she'd taught countless new officers to allow civilians to do. The dashboard camera continued recording, its small red light a reminder that everything was being documented. As she reached slowly toward her purse in the passenger seat, Thompson's flashlight beam followed her movement like a spotlight. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Snow continued to fall outside, creating an eerily peaceful backdrop to this tense encounter. Through the open window, the cold February air bit at her skin, but Captain Anderson remained focused. She'd handled situations far more dangerous than this, yet something about this stop felt different. Maybe it was the way Thompson's boots were planted, or how his fingers drummed against his holster, or perhaps it was just years of experience setting off warning bells in her mind. She could hear more patrol cars approaching in the distance, their sirens growing louder. Thompson had called for backup, for a simple traffic stop. In any other situation, she might have found it amusing. Instead, she felt a deep sadness, knowing this was exactly the kind of policing she'd spent her career trying to change. The grocery store's security lights cast long shadows across the parking lot as another patrol car pulled in, its lights adding to the swirling red and blue display. Captain Anderson took another deep breath, knowing the next few moments would define how this situation played out. Her hand closed around her credentials, including her captain's badge, and she prepared herself for what was about to become a very interesting encounter indeed. The backup patrol car's lights cast dancing shadows across the snowy parking lot as a second officer approached. Captain Anderson remained perfectly still, her hands visible on the steering wheel. 15 years of police work had taught her that these next few moments were crucial. The growing audience of curious onlookers at the grocery store's entrance only added to the tension of the scene. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Thompson demanded, his voice carrying an edge that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The captain knew this request wasn't necessary. She hadn't committed any traffic violation that would warrant leaving her car. Still, she maintained her professional composure. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle?" Her voice remained steady, calm, the same tone she used when teaching de-escalation techniques at the academy. Through her side mirror, she could see the backup officer positioning himself behind her car, hand also resting on his holster. Thompson's response came quick and sharp. "Ma'am, I don't like your attitude. When an officer gives you an order, you comply first and ask questions later." The beam of his flashlight never wavered from her face, despite the well-lit parking lot making it unnecessary. Captain Anderson took a slow, deliberate breath. The dashboard camera continued recording, its small red light a silent witness. She could feel her phone buzzing in her pocket, probably her mom wondering why she wasn't home yet. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Just this morning, she'd been leading a department meeting about proper traffic stop protocols. "Officer Thompson," she began, reading his nameplate again. "I want to cooperate fully, but I need to understand the reason for this stop." She kept her voice level, using the communication techniques she'd spent years teaching. The snow was falling harder now, collecting on her windshield in thick white clumps. A small crowd had gathered near the grocery store's entrance, several people holding up phones, recording the scene. Captain Anderson noticed a young mother hurrying her children inside, away from the confrontation. This was exactly the kind of community interaction she'd been working so hard to change. "Listen here." Thompson's voice grew louder, more aggressive. "Your fancy car and nice clothes don't give you the right to question my authority. One more word, and you'll be dealing with more than just a traffic stop." His flashlight beam swept through her car again, as if searching for something, anything to justify his behavior. The backup officer shifted his position, moving closer to her driver's side window. Captain Anderson could read his nameplate too, Officer Chen. His expression showed discomfort with the situation, but he remained silent. She made a mental note of this. It was another teaching moment about the responsibility officers have to intervene when they witness unprofessional conduct. The cold air continued streaming through her open window, but Captain Anderson barely noticed it now. Her focus was entirely on managing this increasingly volatile situation. In her mind, she was already composing the incident report she would file, not as a complaint, but as a learning opportunity for the department. "I'm reaching for my credentials now," she announced clearly, her movements slow and deliberate. The weight of her captain's badge felt heavier than usual in her pocket. Years of similar experiences had taught her the importance of timing, when to reveal her rank, how to transform a confrontation into a teaching moment. Officer Thompson's posture stiffened. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he shouted, contradicting his earlier demand for documentation. The backup officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the inconsistency in these commands. Through the store windows, Captain Anderson could see more people gathering, phones raised, recording what they probably thought was yet another example of police harassment. Little did they know they were about to witness something quite different. The irony of the situation would have been amusing if it weren't so serious. The tension in the air was palpable as she prepared to reveal her identity. 15 years of working to change the system, of mentoring young officers, of building community trust, all of it had led to this moment. As her hand moved slowly toward her badge, she silently hoped this encounter would become not just another incident report, but a catalyst for real change within the department. The moment hung in the air like the falling snowflakes, delicate but charged with potential. Captain Anderson's hand moved deliberately toward her coat pocket, where her badge rested against her department ID. Through the windshield, she could see Officer Thompson's stance becoming increasingly rigid, his flashlight beam unwavering despite the well-lit surroundings. "I said keep those hands where I can see them." Thompson's voice cracked slightly, betraying his growing agitation. The backup officer, Chen, had taken a small step forward, his expression showing increasing concern about how the situation was escalating. "Officer," Captain Anderson spoke clearly, her voice carrying the weight of authority she'd earned through years of service, "I am following your instructions to provide my identification. I'm going to reach into my coat pocket now." She maintained eye contact through the side mirror, her movements measured and precise. The crowd at the grocery store had grown larger, their phones recording every moment. A teenage boy whispered loudly to his friend, "This isn't right, man." The comment carried clearly through the crisp winter air, causing Thompson to glance nervously at their audience. "Last warning," Thompson barked, his hand now gripping his holster. "Keep those hands on the wheel, or things are gonna get real uncomfortable real fast." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, but there was something else there too, a hint of uncertainty, perhaps triggered by Captain Anderson's unwavering calm. She could feel her phone buzzing again in her pocket. The thought of her worried mother watching the clock, wondering why she hadn't called, added another layer of emotion to the moment. But now wasn't the time for distractions. Years of training and experience had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. "Officer Thompson," she began again, her voice steady and clear, "I want you to listen very carefully. I am a police captain with the Chicago Police Department. I am reaching for my badge and department ID. Your body camera and my dashboard camera are both recording this interaction. Officer Chen is your witness. I am going to move slowly and deliberately." The parking lot fell silent. Even the crowd of onlookers seemed to hold their collective breath. The snow continued falling, adding a surreal quality to the scene as red and blue lights painted the white flakes in alternating colors. Thompson's flashlight beam wavered slightly. "You're what?" His voice had lost some of its aggressive edge, replaced by confusion. Officer Chen had straightened up, his hand dropping away from his holster as understanding began to dawn on his face. With deliberate movements, Captain Anderson reached into her coat pocket and withdrew her badge and ID. The gold shield caught the light from the cruiser's beams, its surface gleaming with authority. "Officer Thompson, I am Captain Anderson of the 7th Precinct. I oversee departmental training and community relations." The change in Thompson's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His flashlight dropped, beam pointing at the ground as he took an involuntary step backward. Officer Chen's eyes had gone wide, and he moved several steps away from the vehicle, his posture completely transformed. I didn't," Thompson stammered, all his previous bravado evaporating like snow on a warm windshield. The crowd at the grocery store had grown quiet, but their phones remained raised, capturing every moment of this unexpected turn of events. Captain Anderson opened her car door slowly, stepping out into the snowy night. Her full height and bearing now on display, she cut an impressive figure in her professional attire. The badge in her hand wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a responsibility she'd earned through years of dedicated service. "Officers," she said, her voice carrying across the parking lot with natural authority, "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about proper traffic stop protocols." She brushed a few snowflakes from her coat sleeve, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension of moments before. The crowd had begun to murmur, phones still recording as they witnessed this extraordinary scene unfold. Some were smiling now, others nodding in approval. This wasn't the ending they'd expected when they'd first pulled out their phones to record what they thought would be another example of police misconduct. Captain Anderson stood perfectly straight, her presence commanding respect without requiring force or threats. The teaching moment she'd been waiting for had arrived, though not in the way she'd expected when she'd left work that evening. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the most unexpected situations. The parking lot had fallen into a hushed silence, broken only by the soft patter of snowflakes and the idle hum of police car engines. Captain Anderson stood tall beside her vehicle, her badge gleaming under the mix of streetlights and flashing red and blue. Officer Thompson's previous confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a look that mixed embarrassment with growing realization. "Both of you turn off your light bars," she instructed, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to command. As the flashing lights ceased, the scene became calmer, though the tension still lingered in the air. The crowd of onlookers remained, their phones still recording, but their expressions had shifted from concern to interest. "Officer Thompson," Captain Anderson began, her tone professional but firm, "would you care to explain why you initiated this traffic stop?" She brushed a few snowflakes from her sleeve, a calm demeanor making the question feel even more powerful. Thompson shifted his weight uncomfortably, his earlier swagger completely gone. I thought I observed," he started, then stopped, unable to complete the sentence. They both knew there had been no traffic violation, no legitimate reason for the stop. "Let's review what happened here," she continued, turning slightly to include Officer Chen in the conversation. "You initiated a traffic stop without probable cause. You escalated a routine interaction into a confrontational situation. You issued contradictory commands, and you made threats to a cooperative civilian." The growing crowd at the grocery store entrance had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold like an impromptu lesson in police accountability. A few people nodded in approval, while others continued recording what had become an unexpected display of proper police leadership. "Captain, I didn't know," Thompson began, but she held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's exactly the point, Officer Thompson. You didn't know. You didn't know I was a captain, but more importantly, you didn't know anything about the person you were treating with such disrespect." Her words carried weight without anger, each one carefully chosen to make an impact. She turned to address Officer Chen as well, her expression serious but not unkind. "And Officer Chen, while you showed discomfort with the situation, you remained silent. Part of our duty is to hold each other accountable. When we see a fellow officer acting inappropriately, we have an obligation to step in." The snow was falling harder now, creating a peaceful backdrop to this impromptu teaching moment. Captain Anderson could see understanding beginning to dawn on both officers' faces. This wasn't just about one traffic stop, it was about the fundamental principles of their profession. "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., both of you will report to my office," she continued. "We're going to review the body camera footage and dashboard camera recording. This will be a learning opportunity, not just about proper traffic stop procedures, but about the impact our actions have on community trust." A young woman in the crowd whispered to her friend, loud enough to be heard, "Now that's what real police leadership looks like." The comment seemed to make Thompson sink even further into himself, while Chen stood straighter, as if already trying to live up to a higher standard. Captain Anderson walked to her car's trunk, opened it, and pulled out 2 department training manuals. She always kept extra copies for situations just like this. "Before our meeting tomorrow, I want you both to review Chapter 3, Community Relations and Professional Conduct. Pay special attention to the sections about bias awareness and de-escalation techniques." The manuals felt heavy in her hands as she passed them to the officers, not just with physical weight, but with the weight of responsibility they carried. Each page represented lessons learned from years of police work, both good and bad. "This incident didn't have to unfold this way," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Every interaction with the public is an opportunity to either build trust or break it. Tonight, we broke trust. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding it." The crowd had begun to disperse, but many lingered, watching this unexpected display of police accountability. Some were nodding in approval, others typing rapidly on their phones, likely sharing what they'd witnessed on social media. This wasn't the story they'd expected to capture when they first pulled out their phones, but perhaps it was the story that needed to be told. The next morning arrived with clear skies and fresh snow covering the city. Captain Anderson sat in her office, reviewing the footage from the previous night's incident. The clock on her wall showed 7:45 a.m. Both officers would be arriving soon for their meeting. She'd come in early, wanting to ensure everything was properly prepared for this important conversation. On her desk lay 3 sets of printed documents: the official traffic stop report, the department's current training protocols, and several community feedback forms she'd collected over the past year. Her computer screen displayed the dashboard camera footage, paused at the moment Officer Thompson first approached her vehicle. A knock on her door broke the morning quiet. Officer Chen entered first, followed by Thompson. Both were 15 minutes early, a good sign. Their uniforms were perfectly pressed, badges gleaming, every detail attended to. The nervousness on their faces reminded her of rookie officers on their first day. "Good morning, officers," she said, gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. "I appreciate your punctuality." Her tone was professional but not cold. This wasn't about punishment, it was about growth and understanding. The office was quiet except for the gentle hum of the heating system and the occasional shuffle of papers. Through her window, she could see the city coming to life, people hurrying through the snow-covered streets below. Somewhere out there, videos of last night's encounter were probably already circulating on social media. "Before we review the footage," Captain Anderson began, "I want to hear from each of you. Officer Chen, let's start with you. What are your thoughts about last night's incident?" She picked up her coffee mug, settling in for what she hoped would be an honest conversation. Chen sat up straighter in his chair. "Captain, I failed in my duty last night," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. "I saw a situation that didn't feel right, but I didn't speak up. I was more concerned about backing up my fellow officer than doing what was right." The captain nodded, appreciating his honesty, and Officer Thompson, She turned to the other chair, where Thompson sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Thompson paused, struggling to find the right words. I made assumptions. I acted on those assumptions. I violated everything we're taught about professional conduct and proper procedure. His voice was quiet but clear. I've been thinking about it all night, Captain. I wouldn't want anyone treating my family the way I treated you. Captain Anderson let the weight of his words settle in the room. Outside her office, the usual morning bustle of the precinct carried on, phones ringing, officers checking in for their shifts, the coffee maker in the break room gurgling to life. What happened last night wasn't just about me, she said, turning her computer screen so both officers could see the footage. Every time we interact with the public, we're not just individual officers, we represent this entire department, this entire profession. She pressed play, and they all watched the scene unfold. In the harsh light of day, every mistake was glaringly obvious. Thompson winced at the sound of his own voice, while Chen shifted uncomfortably each time the camera caught him standing by silently. The community trusts us with enormous power, Captain Anderson continued, pausing the video. With that power comes an equally enormous responsibility. Every traffic stop, every interaction, every moment we're in uniform, we're either building that trust or breaking it. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out 2 folders. These contain civilian complaints from the past year. Not all of them are valid, but each one represents a moment where we could have done better. She spread some of the papers across her desk. Notice anything about these incidents? Both officers leaned forward, scanning the documents. Chen spoke first. They all started as routine interactions. Thompson added quietly, and they all escalated because of officer conduct, not civilian behavior. Captain Anderson smiled slightly. They were getting it. Exactly. Now, here's what we're going to do. She pulled out another set of documents. I'm assigning both of you to help develop our new community engagement training program. Officer Thompson, you'll work with our bias awareness team. Officer Chen, you'll focus on active intervention protocols. The surprise on their faces was evident. They'd clearly expected suspension or worse. But Captain Thompson started, after last night. After last night, she interrupted gently, you both demonstrated that you're capable of recognizing mistakes and willing to learn from them. That's exactly the mindset we need for this program. Through her office window, she could see more snow beginning to fall, adding fresh white powder to yesterday's accumulation. Like the fresh snow covering yesterday's tracks, this was an opportunity for a clean start, not just for these 2 officers, but for the entire department. 3 months had passed since that snowy February night. The Chicago spring brought warming temperatures and new beginnings to the city. Inside the community center's main hall, Captain Anderson stood at the podium, looking out over a packed room of faces, police officers, community members, local leaders, and media representatives. When I started this enhanced training program, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, it came from a place of personal experience. But what began as a response to one incident has grown into something much more meaningful. The slideshow behind her displayed statistics and photographs from the new community engagement initiatives. In the front row, Officer Thompson sat up straight in his dress uniform. He'd spent the last 12 weeks helping develop and implement new training protocols. The change in him was visible, not just in his posture, but in his entire approach to policing. Beside him, Officer Chen nodded along, taking notes for the peer intervention workshop he would be leading next week. Our department has seen a 40% decrease in civilian complaints, Captain Anderson continued, clicking to the next slide. But more importantly, we've seen a 60% increase in positive community feedback. These aren't just numbers, they represent real changes in how our officers interact with the public. The audience listened intently. Among them were many familiar faces from that night in the parking lot. The young mother who had hurried her children inside, now serving on the community advisory board. The teenage boy who had spoken up, now participating in the Youth Police Dialogue program. Officer Thompson, would you like to share your experience? Captain Anderson stepped aside, giving him the podium. As he stood, she could see how far he'd come from that night. His transformation had become a powerful example of how confronting bias could lead to real change. Thompson approached the microphone, no longer the aggressive officer from that winter evening. 3 months ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career, he began, his voice steady. Instead, it became the wake-up call I needed. Working with our community members has opened my eyes to perspectives I never considered before. The room remained silent, absorbed in his words. Through the windows, spring sunlight streamed in, warming the wooden floors and creating an atmosphere of hope and possibility. A local news crew filmed quietly from the back, their cameras capturing this moment of transparency and growth. Captain Anderson watched as Thompson shared specific examples of how the new training had changed his approach to traffic stops. He described recent encounters where he'd used de-escalation techniques, how he'd learned to recognize his own biases, and most importantly, how he'd begun helping other officers do the same. Officer Chen followed with his presentation on active intervention protocols. "We're teaching officers that staying silent isn't being loyal," he explained. "True loyalty to our fellow officers means helping them stay true to their oath to protect and serve." The captain's phone buzzed quietly in her pocket, a message from her mother, proud of how her daughter had turned a potentially tragic incident into a catalyst for change. She smiled, remembering their conversation the morning after the traffic stop, how her mother had said, "Baby, sometimes the hardest moments lead to the biggest breakthroughs." As the presentations concluded, community members lined up to share their own experiences with the new programs. An elderly gentleman spoke about feeling respected during a recent traffic stop. A young student described a positive interaction with officers at a neighborhood basketball game. Each story represented a small step toward rebuilt trust. "This is just the beginning," Captain Anderson said, retaking the podium for her closing remarks. "Real change doesn't happen overnight. It happens through consistent effort, through acknowledging our mistakes, through being willing to learn and grow." She gestured to the room full of officers and community members, now working together instead of viewing each other with suspicion. What happened that night in February could have been just another negative story about police conduct. Instead, it became the foundation for genuine transformation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the community center windows as the event wound down. People lingered, forming small groups, sharing experiences, and building connections. Captain Anderson watched it all, knowing that true change happened in these small moments of understanding. Outside, spring flowers had begun blooming in the community center's garden, new life emerging from ground that had been frozen just months before. Like those flowers, trust was growing again between the police and their community, proving that even the coldest winters eventually give way to spring.